Turned to focus on Pigford for a long time. When I was elected to Congress, I had one of the FSA employees who had been deployed to Washington, D.C. to handle the handout of the money to the Pigford claimants. And what I got handed was a whole stack of applications for Pigford claims. I didn't really know what it was or what it meant at the time. I looked through them, and he didn't tell me very much. He just wanted to make sure that someone had them in their control. So a couple of years later, I was sitting in a hearing in the Judiciary Committee, and sometimes these topics will come up unresearched, and it turned out to be Pigford. It was the argument that we should open up the filings to Pigford again for those who were not able to file the first time. Well, that was another effort to try to do a payout based along the lines of race. And so I raised my objections, dug into Pigford, got informed, and in 2007, when we were marking up the Farm Bill, I sat down with one of the top administrators of Pigford, and we talked way past midnight about what really happened. And this individual handled many of the cases, talked on the telephone with many of the claimants of Pigford, went through many of the files, and no one could probably look through all of them by then. But I asked this question: Is it true that African Americans were discriminated against by the USDA? The answer that I got, and a very serious look, was yes. And I said, how many? And the answer was 50. And I said 50? You mean, remember we have 94,000 claims. 50, you mean 50,000? No, I mean 50. That's how many people I think were discriminated against, and that individual had dealt with more of the cases than anyone else. There were a lot of other details in that conversation that flowed from it, and I turned more focus on it because of that. I raised the issue and brought an amendment to block the funding to Pigford. If I remember right, I got 155 votes for it. I needed 218 in the House alone. Who knows if the Senate would have followed through. But when Tom Vilsack became Secretary of Agriculture, he became the successor to the Pigford issue, and he became an advocate for it. Now, if you remember the Shirley Sherrod case that became so notorious, Andrew Breitbart released a video of a tape she gave to the NAACP, and when she said that she was discriminating against white farmers, the NAACP crowd applauded and cheered because they believed that that kind of racism was okay. Well, in any case, when that was released, Tom Vilsack fired Shirley Sherrod almost on the spot.
Yep.
And I believe he was ordered to do so by the President of the United States or Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel. Tom Vilsack would have done due diligence on that before he would have acted. He does not do things impulsively. So I believe he was acting on the orders of the White House. In any case, he fired Shirley Sherrod, and she was a USDA employee. Curious thing is that he also is the guy that hired her. He had hired her the previous July 25th, which was 3 days after she received the announcement of the settlement in her lawsuit in Pigford, which is the largest civil rights claim in the history of America, around $13.7 million for a collective farm operation that she and others were together on down in Georgia. So she received a notice that they had won a lawsuit against the federal government, the USDA, and against Tom Vilsack for $13.7 million. That was July 22nd. Tom Vilsack then hired her July 25th. Curious, isn't it?
Wow.
You would put a plaintiff like that on your payroll, and then when Andrew Breitbart released the information, the video, then he fired her, then he hired her back again, and they had this press conference where there was a nice little teary hug and everything was all right, and he tried to hire her back. It took some months for him to hire her back. Meanwhile, Shirley Sherrod, as far as I know, is still suing Andrew Breitbart, not Tom Vilsack. Tom Vilsack has been an advocate for handing out money to minorities through this process, and I have sat with him in my office, and he's argued that a law that I voted for directed him to do that. That's not true. There is a $100 million cap in the Farm Bill legislation. I didn't put that in there. I once voted for it, and I once voted against it because there were other components of that bill. But it was the language in there says specifically that it's to resolve any and all outstanding Pigford cases. Tom Vilsack twisted that 180 degrees from the statutory limit that are there, and worked with Eric Holder to go hand out more money to the Pigford claimants, even though much of it is fraud. Most of it is fraud. I would not say all of it is fraud. And now they've used it to leverage this into payouts to Hispanic farmers who many of them were not discriminated against. Many of them never came forward to claim they were discriminated against. For African, or well, for Native American farmers and for women farmers. So what they're doing is reaching into the public treasury, really borrowing money from China to pay off minority groups. And what does that do? That creates monolithic voting blocks among minorities. We know they've done that with African Americans, clearly and cynically, and now you'll see that President Obama gets about 96% of the African American vote. And then they're seeking to do the same thing with the Hispanic vote. This is part of it. This payoff is part of it. Calling Republicans racist is another part of that strategy. They're up to 71% of the Hispanic vote. They want to get that up to 92 or 96% of the Hispanic vote. They want to do the same thing with Native Americans. They want to do the same thing with women. And so this is, I believe, a cynical political ploy. And they're funding this out of the Judgment Fund, which is a fund that exists within the Justice Department. Congress doesn't have oversight over that fund. And so, for example, if Eric Holder negotiates a settlement with BP for an oil spill in the Gulf, which they've done, that money, which was something I think over $2 billion, was rolled into the Judgment Fund. They use the money in the Judgment Fund to pay off their political allies, and that's what we've got going. So this spotlight of the New York Times, an article that I knew was coming for some time, it's a vindication article. It's a vindication of Andrew Breitbart, who was a great partner in bringing this out. I believe I do deserve the credit for bringing this forward and connecting Andrew Breitbart with the policy, but he had the heart and the perseverance to trudge onward. And so I have pushed forward on this too. We'll have to see what happens at this point. I'm looking at whether we can bring about hearings. I just sent out a bill draft request during this eggs and issues while someone else was giving a long answer. A bill draft request to cap the disbursements out of the Judgment Fund to no more than $100 million without congressional approval. That's one of the things that we can do. We need to do investigations, and I'll be talking to the relevant committee chairs. They already know I'm looking at this. And by the way, I chair the subcommittee that has oversight over the USDA. So we need to get a farm bill written. We need to get some of those bumps out of the road, clear this thing out, and at that point I believe I'll be in a position where I can start to drill down into this much more deeply.